We're we're doing okay. The uh, it's it's a road with a ditch on both sides, and the media seems to be driving us. Hysteria, particularly, seems to be driving us into the ditch on one side or the other. On the one side, it's to underreact to this, to try to maintain normalcy in all ways. And the ditch on the other side is to treat it like it's the zombie apocalypse. So, and the news media seems to be keeping both sides well stoked. So today, in two different conversations, one person mentioned to me, talking about a church member, she had a slight fever and a little bit of a sore throat. She got it from her husband, who displayed no symptoms at all. They're both now over the virus and they're fine. And then another person I was talking to, they have a loved one on life support, and probably that person won't make it. And both tended to normalize their situation. So it's a challenge. The fact that uh, they say about 80% of us really aren't at much risk at all, and therefore we're doing this to protect the 10% or the 20%, whatever the remaining percentage is. I think makes sense. I do think the isolating measures seem to be slowing down the spread. So, uh, we're doing the best we can. As I mentioned, our governor just an hour and a half ago put us on shelter at home for the next 30 days. So we're suddenly going, whoa, what does that look like? So, so I'm doing okay. Trying to
Okay.
figure out. Uh, these are real people with um, real needs, real job situations. So we're trying to figure out how, as a university, we can minimize the financial losses that we're having. On the other hand, these are real people who need their real jobs. So um, I think uh, there's a lot of stress, I think, involved, because these are not what color should we paint the dining room kinds of decisions. Bill, it has helped, obviously, in my own personal prayer life and devotional life. Uh, Yesterday, I was reading Psalm 91 when it talks about the plague will not come near you, kind of thing. So it reminds us that uh, the history of God's people have had plagues in the past, and that God often uses them as times in which He builds the character of His people. I've been enjoying reading the thoughtful words uh, by Christian thinkers, including uh, the risk that Americans have of making an idol out of my own personal safety, that I need to preserve my own personal safety at all costs, when historically Christians were the ones known for caring for others, even sometimes at the risk of personal safety. It's made me watch some news clips where I've seen people, first responders, who've done incredibly brave things, and firefighters are supposed to run toward the flames. That's kind of the definition of it. And then they'll interview someone who has said, I can't do that. That would put me at risk. And and it's kind of highlighted, well, the definition of a firefighter is to run toward the flames. You wouldn't be much of a firefighter if you said, I can't be near the fire, I might get burned. And the same thing with a healthcare provider to say, well, there's sick people there. I can't be around them. Well, that's kind of the definition of a healthcare provider. So it has reminded me that as Christians, we have a certain moral fiber that helps us to make these difficult decisions. When we take the moral fiber and the moral grounding away, it often leaves a person with no basis upon which to make their. I mean, if they got into nursing for the salary, then suddenly they're looking at it and saying, that salary is not enough for me to put my personal safety at risk. Yes, but and if that's why they got into nursing, okay. But I think as a Christian nurse, and our university has a nursing program, as a Christian nurse, he or she is saying, I feel called to help people at their time of need. And I think that provides the moral fortitude that they need to make selfless decisions. You, it's hard to make a selfless decision if your only criteria is selfishness. So I think my Christian faith has helped me. I think our Christian faith, our shared Christian faith, has a lot to say in this regard. I thought David Brooks's editorial a few days ago about the moral challenge involved in this crisis was a very helpful piece. I think it's in the New York Times. It does tend to fall kind of an Eastern-Western break, but there's a lot of subcultures in the West that are collectivist. It's interesting. Someone, and I don't have the name of the author right off the top of my head, I apologize. Someone had done a study of individualist cultures and collectivist cultures. And of course, it's actually a scale that goes from the most individual to the most collective. And it is interesting that it won't surprise us that America and England are the two most individualist countries. What's fascinating is the next most individualist, if you have it on a scale, the third most individualist is pretty much in the center. So the US and Britain has so skewed the scale that really you have to leave them off. They blow the curve. You have to leave them off, and everything else makes a pretty nice spectrum from collectivist to individualist. And then way out are the US and Britain. So when we talk about our individualism, we're off the scale individualists. Now, having said that, there are plenty of collectivist subcultures in the US. So it's basically, how do I see the world? Is it me or a we? How do I think about who I am and my world around me? Is it a we or a me? And it's a little hard to define because the most important things in a culture are usually kind of hard to define. The first time I ran into this, Bill, was I was in Indonesia, and I had a student who had a little bit of a cold, and she was being just a real pansy about it, actually. And I was fluent in the language at the time, and I just wanted to tell her, look, you just need to toughen up. And I realized I didn't have a word for it. And so the next day I was talking with an Indonesian friend and trying to figure out what the Indonesian word for that was. And I realized I had a hard time defining what being tough was. I mean, we all know what it is. And you can be tough in a delicate and feminine way. Uh, and you can be tough in a massive, but we know what being tough is. And yet, boy, it is really hard to explain. I finally gave up. I couldn't explain. And so there are a lot of things in this book that were hard to define. But what we tried to say was that if you're a collectivist, there are three big elephants in the room in just about any situation. And those elephants are kinship, patronage, and brokerage or mediation. And what's interesting, particularly with Americans and Brits, we know those three things, but generally we define them negatively. Kinship is defined as nepotism. Patronage, it's already its own negative term. And and mediation or brokerage is the middleman. And our goal is to get rid of all three. We don't want any of them involved in the picture. And yet my collectivist friends would absolutely want them. So there's a fun cartoon, Bill. It was an Arab cartoon years ago where a guy finds a lamp with a genie in it. And the genie's lazy, only wants to give one wish. And so the guy wishes, he said, I want you to find me the world's best broker. Now, what struck us about this cartoon was that would never even have occurred to us to ask for. And now, what made it a funny cartoon in the Arab world was the genie had a really hard time finding one because that's often their challenges. To find someone to mediate for you is really difficult. But then the genie finally finds them one, and the broker negotiates more wishes. So it ends up being a great wish on the part of the guy. So those three things are kind of the big values in a collectivist culture. And then people say, well, what about honor and shame? Well, the interesting thing is honor and shame really aren't values. They are tools that we use for maintaining and enforcing and reinforcing our values. So they will use honor and they'll use shame and they'll use boundaries to enforce and reinforce their values. So it was actually at your conference that I was hammering this out, and I was speaking with some Chinese friends there, and I said, I think these are tools. And they said, no, no, they're not tools. And they were very agitated. And I thought, oh, okay. So help me to understand, what are they? So they talked in Mandarin for a few minutes. They came back, they said, they're not tools. I said, okay. They're means. No, 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 no. They're not means, because they realized that was going down the same road. They said they're method. No, no, they're not methods. So then they argued in Mandarin for a while. They came back and they said they're buckets. I said, buckets. All right. Well, help me to understand that. They said they're what you put the values in. And they seemed very happy with that. I left a little bit confused. Um, but in talking with some friends of mine who were a little more open to dialogue, some Chinese friends of mine, they said, well, we don't like the image of a tool, but they are what we use to enforce values. So that's why honor can mean one thing in this group and honor can mean something else to another group. Because honor doesn't actually mean either one. Honor is enforcing that value or reinforcing that value or teaching that value, that kind of thing. So that's what the book's about. The place where I've noticed it more is in our own national narrative, because it's harder to push folks to do the right thing if you're only pushing using individualist values. And so I have seen our culture fishing back for older values that tended to be more collectivist and making, you need to do this for all of our benefit. You need to curtail your individual freedom for the group's benefit. And what I have seen that's interesting is they'll make a persuasive argument, and my collectivist friends are like, well, yeah, that's obvious. It seems to them it went without being said. I'm going to give two different answers to that. One is, I think in their own personal life, they need to lean on their faith even more heavily. And I think to lean on, let me rephrase that. They need to lean on our faith more heavily. That we need to take a larger view picture, that God is using this for our good. It may not pan out well in an individual situation, but for his people, he will use this to bring about good, in the same way he did in Jeremiah's day. So he knows the plans he has for all of us, plans to prosper all of us. and not to harm all of us, even though there were individuals who no doubt were in harm's way. So I think um, for myself personally, I need to lean on our faith, including when my own faith starts to wobble. I need to lean on my community's faith. Let their confidence help carry me in times when I'm weak. So I would say individually that's answer. And then as they are helping to lead, when they're talking to individuals, those people who have a Christian faith, for instance, we need to remind them that our faith has always been a selfless faith, that the heart of the gospel is sacrifice, and that if the messaging that we're hearing, I need to protect me and mine, is a little bit of a message running counter to the gospel. We cannot abandon Matthew 25, where we care for the last, the lost, the least, the lonely. We cannot abandon Matthew 25 in a time of crisis. That historically, the Christian faith has built a reputation. The great Christian, no, sorry, the great Roman pagan Julian, absolutely not a Christian, uh, the great pagan Julian had to admit that Christians were far more noble during the time of plague than any of his counterparts were. That we have built a reputation that we would stand in the gap and we would minister, we would sacrifice in times like this. So the question becomes, if that was our reputation in the first century, it was our reputation in 160, is our reputation in 240, is our reputation in the 400s, what will be our reputation in the 21st century? We have a chance to stand in a noble heritage with our Christian brothers and sisters, or we can really be squeezed into the world's mold, like Romans 12 argues we shouldn't be. I think, Bill, hooray for you and for the center in reaching across lines, in this case, from one coast to the other, uh, to say that as a Christian church, we can speak with one voice in a time, and we can hold each other up, lift each other up. We can encourage one another. We can use, in the book, I talk about the good kind of shaming, or we can, in a sense, in a good kind of way, use shaming to say, look, this is not the time for us to hide and and lock ourselves in a closet. This is a time for Christians to step forward and be what we've always been. And so you're giving a chance for those messages to get out. Thank you.